Welcome to the 2019-2020 Lectures in Catholic Experience. Special welcome to any of you who may be here at St. Jerome's University for the first time. We're happy that you could be with us this evening, and welcome back to so many faces. It's great to see you again. I want to begin by acknowledging that we are on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. The university is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 10 kilometers on each side of the Grand River. We give thanks for the privilege to work and live on this land, and we are committed to building respectful relationships with Indigenous people and communities to enhance our knowledge and learn how we can have an active role in reconciliation. My name is Christina Vanine. I am the Vice President, Academic and Dean, Interim, here at St. Jerome's University. And I'm here tonight actually on behalf of Dr. David Seljak, who is coordinating this year's lecture series, and you'll see him in November. So before we get started, if you haven't already done so, please make sure that your electronic devices are turned off as far as possible. That's the right thing to say? No, put them on. I don't know what you're supposed to say these days. I just say turn them off, as close to that as you can get. Thank you. Last Saturday, October the 12th, Pope Francis announced an event that's going to take place in Rome next May on the theme, Reinventing the Global Compact on Education. As he stated a few years ago in his encyclical Laudato Si, in this document and this call for this event, Pope Francis reiterates an invitation for dialogue among all people, for a rekindling of dedication for and with young people, and a renewal for a more open and inclusive education, one that includes patient listening, constructive dialogue, and better mutual understanding. So in this call, he says, never before has there been such a need to unite our efforts in broad educational alliance, to form mature individuals capable of overcoming division and antagonism, and to restore the fabric of relationships for the sake of a more fraternal humanity. Pope Francis recognizes that today's world is facing a variety of cultural and anthropological crises. It's an era of rapid change that calls for an educational process that involves everyone. This dialogue and search for global agreement about an education that integrates and respects all aspects of the person, he says, will need to unite studies and everyday life, teachers, students, and their families, and civil society in its intellectual, scientific, artistic, athletic, political, business, and charitable dimensions. That wonderful call for this event, though, raises a question for me. Is there any connection between this wonderful call for global dialogue and how we are going to shape the future of our planet, and how the Catholic Church develops its various statements and teachings about gender and sexuality? This evening, we're very fortunate to have Dr. Myroslaw Tataryn with us to help us think critically about the meaning and significance and background of documents such as the one published by the Congregation for Catholic Education last June on gender theory. Dr. Tataryn is Professor Emeritus of Religious Studies here at St. Jerome's University. He's a married Ukrainian Greco-Catholic priest serving as pastor of Holy Transfiguration Parish in downtown Kitchener. Dr. Tataryn served as the Vice President and Academic Dean here at St. Jerome's from 2005 to 2011, and during that term he also served as our interim president for 1 year. While here, he has served as chair of the Religious Studies Department, as director of the Center for Responsible Citizenship, with an important contribution to our Beyond Borders program, and he has taught and supervised in our Master of Catholic Thought program. Dr. Tataryn holds a THD degree and a Master Divinity degree from the University of St. Michael's College. His most recent work Discovering Trinity and Disability, A Theology for Embracing Difference, was co-authored with his wife, Maria Truchan-Tataryn. Dr. Tataryn has authored many books and papers in the history of the Ukrainian Greco-Catholic Church in Canada and on topics in Eastern Christian theology. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Myroslaw Tataryn to speak to us on the topic, gender, but that's what the Church has always taught.
Thank you very much, Christina, and thank you to David as well, I'll pass it on, for the invitation, and thank you all for coming this evening. Religion, sexuality, maybe even politics. What a landmine I've agreed to step into. Well, first of all, let's imagine this as the topic of a Catholic public lecture 20 or 30 years ago. We can't, because it wasn't happening. That's not to say that it should not have, but it underlines how new the confluence of questions and issues is in the consciousness of mainstream society, never mind in the consciousness of the church hierarchy. We're not entering onto a path well trodden, but it's a path we can and must walk down. The imperative comes from one of the most important documents in the life of the Church in memory. I speak, of course, of Gaudium et Spes, Vatican II's pastoral constitution on the Church in the modern world, promulgated in 1965. Just a note here, when I'm citing the Vatican documents, I'm using the official translations, so unfortunately the language is not inclusive. But I do so in order that we be aware of the challenges that still face the Church. Very simply, that document states in no uncertain terms that the follower of Christ cannot but be engaged with the world, with, quote, the joys and hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of the men of this age, especially those who are poor or in any way afflicted. Nothing genuinely human fails to raise an echo in their hearts. But as we engage this process, it's also important to acknowledge someone who was called, quote, the invisible presence at Vatican II. He was called that by Pope Paul VI. Someone who, just this past Sunday, was proclaimed a saint of the Universal Church, and who, according to our own Cardinal Mark Willett, should be recognized as a doctor of the Church. I speak here of John Henry Newman. Newman deservedly is credited with enunciating a critical, but often denied truth about the Church's teaching. The Church's teaching develops. I cite Cardinal Willett. Thus, although the deposit of faith does not change, the Church's knowledge of it progresses, deepens, and is expressed in a new way, always faithful to the original idea. History demonstrates that this deepening is fundamental to the character of the Church. But that doesn't happen automatically. It involves a process. The International Theological Commission has stated, quote, a criterion of Catholic theology is that it should be in consistent, constant dialogue with the world. It should help the Church to read the signs of the times, illuminated by the light that comes from divine revelation, and to profit from doing so in its life and mission, end quote. More recently, Pope Francis reminded us, if there is one word that we should never tire of repeating, it is this, dialogue. We are called to promote a culture of dialogue by every possible means, and thus to rebuild the fabric of society. The culture of dialogue entails a true apprenticeship and a discipline that enables us to view others as valid dialogue partners, to respect the foreigner, the immigrant, and people from different cultures as worthy of being listened to. Today, we urgently need to engage all members of society in building a culture which privileges dialogue as a form of encounter, and in creating a means for building consensus and agreement, while seeking the goal of a just, responsive, and inclusive society. Thus, the need to engage with the modern world, with its issues and questions, awareness of our imperative to continue to deepen our understanding of God's revelation, and a commitment to a process of dialogue form the basis of our inquiry this evening. This past June, Dr. Vanine has mentioned, the Congregation for Catholic Education published a document entitled Male and Female He Created Them. The document immediately sets out the context and burning questions as perceived by the congregation. The document speaks of an educational crisis described in its second paragraph. Quote, "The context in which the mission of education is carried out is characterized by challenges emerging from various forms of an ideology that is given the general name gender theory, which denies the difference and reciprocity in nature of a man and woman and envisages a society without sexual differences, thereby eliminating the anthropological basis of the family." End quote. Now, one may or may not agree that questions raised by gender theory constitute a crisis in education. But I think we can all agree that the Church needs to become a participant in the debates produced by the various forms of gender theory. The document is a voice in the contemporary dialogue, but a voice aimed at assisting the members of the Church by both inviting us to engage the question and providing guidance of that voice in that process. However, it is very important that we recognize the nature of the voice. The document's full title states the following: Towards a Path of Dialogue on the Question of Gender Theory in Education. The process laid out for this dialogue relies on, quote, 3 guiding principles seen as best suited to meet the needs of both individuals and communities: to listen, to reason, and to propose. Although the document then goes on to present the congregation's understanding of gender theory via this process, it does not bring the discussion of gender theory to an authoritative conclusion. In fact, quote, "The Christian educational proposal fosters deeper dialogue, true to its objective to promote the realization of man and woman through the development of all their being, incarnate spirits, and of the gifts of nature and of grace by which they are enriched by God." End quote. Therefore, my purpose this evening is to enhance our common understanding of how we are to engage in this deeper dialogue in order to better serve our Christian mission to bring joy and hope to the world. Clearly, the question of gender theory and the manner in which the Church approaches such questions takes us into the realm of moral theology. So I immediately provide a disclaimer. I am not a moral theologian. Rather, my approach is that of a systematic theologian, deeply imbued with a sense of the need to understand the history of the development of the Church's teaching. Earlier, I noted the contribution of Newman, affirmed by Cardinal Willett, in opening the Church to see itself engaged in the process of the development of doctrine, a process which initially related to how, over the ages, the entire Church formulates, struggles with, and often reformulates its fundamental truths, not because the truth changes, but because historical moment, cultural context, linguistic necessities all affect the reception of truth. As a result, the truth needs to be reformulated in order for it to be understood. For example, in 325, the Council of Nicaea established the truth that the Son is homoousios with the Father, that is, Jesus, the Son of God, is divine. Although the implication of that truth was that the human being, Jesus, of Nazareth, was both human and divine, it became necessary a century later for the Council of Chalcedon to establish the formula which spoke of Jesus as fully human and fully divine in one divine person. Those words continue to this day as the binding formula of our Christian faith. Yet in explaining the formula, we instructors must always remind the listener that although we use this word person, we don't exactly mean it in the manner of our current psychological understanding of personhood. Additionally, although the formula is perceived by most Christians as binding, there are Christians whose predecessors did not accept the Council of Chalcedon and therefore rejected the formula. We, on this side of the argument, used to call them heretics. Of course, they used to call us heretics as well. But today, after much dialogue, those who accept Chalcedon and those who reject it agree that we all hold to the same truths about the person of Jesus Christ. We have, I believe, over the past 50 years become comfortable with this understanding of development or deepening of fundamental Christian teaching. But does this apply to moral teaching? Can something have been clearly a mortal sin in one age and not so sinful in another age? Can the church's teaching on sex, sexual relations, gender, change? Before attempting to answer the questions, I think it important that we understand that the source of Catholic moral teaching is not and has never been singular. In fact, quote, Catholic moral theology accepts a quadrilateral of sources of moral knowledge: Scripture, tradition, reason, and experience, end quote. Developing moral teaching is therefore complex and ongoing, given that human experience varies and understanding of tradition is not homogeneous. In fact, as the Church opens itself to hear more voices, the development of moral teaching becomes more and more complex. It is imperative to remember that, quote, in a church that is a communion of believers, the resolution of different construals of experience to arrive at moral truth requires an open, respectful, charitable, and prayerful dialogue, such as that lauded and rhetorically embraced by Pope John Paul II, end quote. Thus, it should not surprise that when we look at the history of the Church, we actually do see major shifts in moral teaching. There are 4 significant instances in church history that demonstrate this capacity of the Church to change its moral teaching. I speak here of the teaching on usury, accepting interest on a loan, slavery, marriage, and freedom of conscience. Although no formal teaching has been declared on this matter yet, I would add that the Church is changing its understanding of the nature of male and female. In fact, I would argue the underlying question really is a question of theological anthropology. How do we understand our humanness? But given all the talk in the election about economics, let's start with our wallets. Usury. Usury was the practice of receiving a benefit, interest, from loaning money to someone, a common and generally benign practice today. However, in the early Church, the practice was condemned at all levels of the Church. Widely seen as a form of oppression of the poor, the condemnation of usury became so ingrained in church teaching that in the 12th century, Pope Alexander III proclaimed it a sin that even a pope could not forgive. Then in the 14th century, the Council of Vienne went as far as declaring, quote, "If anyone should fall into that error of pertinaciously persisting to affirm that interest-taking is not a sin, we declare he should be punished as a heretic," end quote. So if you're working at a bank, clearly taking interest on a loan was not regarded as a trivial matter. It was a grave offense, evoking the most extreme punishment. Nonetheless, if any of you have offered someone a loan and accepted interest payments, I don't think you or the Church believed yourselves guilty of a heinous offense. What changed? Business. Gradually, as forms of commerce in Western Europe shifted, and first limited interest and then less restrictive interest payments became the norm, the Church grew slowly more and more silent on the issue. I quote John Noonan here, "The customs of the business community were powerful support for any approach that permitted moderate profit from the extension of credit. Between 1450 and 1750, the rules changed so that only the simulacrum of the prohibition remained, even though papal authority was unwilling to admit as much until the 19th century. when confessors were instructed by Rome as to penitents asking about usury, do not disturb them. Sounds like early evidence of don't ask, don't tell. But more importantly, it is evidence of the Church deepening its understanding after reflecting on the actual lived experience of the faithful. Now we turn to a practice that was completely acceptable even by New Testament writers, but today is unequivocally abhorrent: slavery. For biblical authors, quote, slaveholding as an institution is presented as divinely sanctioned, end quote. The only early Christian writer that we know of who explicitly condemned slavery was Gregory of Nyssa. One of my favorite saints, by the way. It must be noted, however, that being a slave did not exclude one from being a member of the church. Ostensibly, in God's eyes, a slave was equal to his or her master, but in human eyes, worthy of subjugation. Popes possessed slaves. Popes bought and sold slaves. Popes even gave slaves as gifts. Even the exceptional case of the 16th century Dominican Bartolomé de las Casas, who explicitly condemned the holding of indigenous Amerindians as Spanish slaves and suffered greatly for it, demonstrates how difficult it was for faithful people to free themselves of this cultural blindness. Again, Noonan. Las Casas cannot be called an abolitionist because he did not believe in abolition. He accepted the institution of slavery. He helped bring blacks as slaves to the Indies. Yet he worked more strenuously against slavery than anyone who preceded him. No abolitionist, when abolitionists appeared centuries later, confronted the concrete evils of a slaveholding society with more passion and courage. To a moral challenge that seemed Sisyphean, he brought what was essential to his task: experience, empathy, energy, and endurance. He put himself in the place of the oppressed. In the history of thought on slavery, de las Casas towers over other men of his era and most other men today. As recently as the 19th century, Pope Leo XIII, who himself sanctioned an annual collection to assist the work of abolitionists, defended those Christians who held slaves because they were more generous and gentle than non-believers who did not recognize the fundamental equality of all human beings. Even as recently as the Code of Canon Law published in 1917, it did not suggest that holding slaves was sinful, but did implicitly admit the validity of the institution's force when it stated that a marriage was invalid if contracted between a free person and a slave who had not received permission of the master. The first categorical condemnation of slavery by the official church occurred in my lifetime at Vatican II, when in Gaudium et Spes, slavery was included in a list of actions shameful and offensive to human dignity. In 1992, the Catechism of the Catholic Church listed slavery as a sin against the seventh commandment. Finally, quote, the magisterium came into harmony with the thinking of the body of the faithful, end quote. By the end of the 20th century, church teaching had caught up to the practice of the overwhelming majority of the church, which had been opposing slavery in some cases for over 100 years. There's no doubt that also marriage is one of the institutions most vigorously defended by the church over the centuries. Yet, we must not mistake defense of the institution for an unchanging teaching. First of all, without denying its sacramental character, it's important to remember that initially Christians took part in marriage through the same ritual that Roman citizens would have done. The first suggestion of a Christian aspect to marriage comes from Ignatius of Antioch at the beginning of the 2nd century. He suggests, in the manner of it would be nice, that it's right for men and women who marry to be united with the consent of a bishop. But we have to wait until the latter quarter of the century to learn more when Tertullian in North Africa speaks of the need to actually seek the permission of a bishop to contract a marriage. However, the actual ritual that the couple engage in is the same as that of non-Christians. Unique Christian marriage rituals seem to be a product of the 4th century in Western Europe, and they only gradually developed in other areas, and North Africa specifically. North Africa is important, of course, because that's where Bishop Augustine of Hippo lived. Augustine of Hippo, for one, seemed to have focused his attention more on the nature of marriage contract than on the ritual. Augustine referred on numerous occasions to the reading and signing of a marriage contract. He said, because they were signed by a bishop, the tabula matrimonialis, the document itself, indicated that the covenant between the couple was being accorded ecclesial recognition. But while these documents themselves were largely secular, dealing with matters of dowry and inheritance, they were of great significance for Augustine, because they contained the phrase, quote, for the sake of producing children, end quote. The documents served to define the essential purpose of sex and marriage for Augustine, and he hoped for his congregation. The similarity between the marriage contracts and other forms of property agreements suggested to Augustine that the relationship between husband and wife could best be understood in similarly proprietary terms. The husband was to be considered the dominus, and the wife the ancillary. Augustine's concern about the ends of marriage became preeminently significant in the development of a theology of marriage, and also of our understanding of a male-female binary. More on that later. With the expansion of the Church's claim over marriage, which resulted in its becoming a sacrament, and thus of divine institution, over time a significant challenge arose. Can marriages be dissolved? The answer was developed over the course of the 12th century, when the Church claimed the right to dissolve a marriage in particular circumstances. This came to be called the Pauline privilege. A person who is baptized after their marriage may have their marriage with an unbaptized person dissolved should the unbaptized partner so wish or be antagonistic to the other's Christian faith. Significantly, this principle is based not on a divine statement, but on a reading of St. Paul in his letter to the Corinthians, chapter 7, verses 12 to 15. An excerpt which he begins with important words. I say, I, and not the Lord. From our perspective, Paul's words provide an exception to the norms of a divine institution. Not because of a claim of the Lord's words, but because of his judgment. An expansion of this practice developed in the 16th century. Faced with the issue of polygamy in missionary lands, the papacy expanded its understanding of the right of dissolubility to include cases where marriages of non-baptized persons could be dissolved, since the marriage was not sacramental, and thus the dissolution would allow one of the parties to marry a baptized Catholic in a Catholic church. Quote, now it appeared that what was intrinsically indissoluble might be dissoluble extrinsically, that is, by the application of a superior power. End quote. The expansion of papal power from a focus on teaching in the first millennium to a firm hand on governance in the second millennium provided the support for the papal office to defend the truth of marriage as being made by divine institution, yet at the same time dissoluble by the pastoral prerogative of the Church. Change did not stop there, though. I said earlier that Augustine was unequivocal in his assertion that procreation was the sole true end of a Christian marriage. In fact, this concept predated Christianity. It's rooted in the Roman understanding of natural law. For centuries, though, for Christians, the focus of the teaching on marriage was the biological act, involving the belief that the male was the active principle, providing the sperm, and the woman the passive principle, providing the womb. the socially restrictive role of women was considered to be embedded in biology. This approach identified, quote, the moral and human act with the physical or biological aspect of the act. In light of Vatican II's broader understanding of the human person and morality, debates arose as to whether it was adequate to simply focus on what was called the intrinsic end, that is, procreation. The 1983 revision of the Code of Canon Law encapsulated the result of those debates when in its Canon 1055, number 1, it stated, quote, the marriage covenant by which a man and a woman establish themselves a partnership of their whole life, and which of its own very nature is ordered to the well-being of the spouses and the creation and upbringing of children, has, between the baptized, been raised by Christ the Lord to the dignity of sacrament. We've added a new end, the well-being of the spouses. The concluding statement of the Synod on the Family moves in this direction when it asserts, quote, the goal of conjugal life is not simply to live together for life, but to love one another for life, end quote. Love, joy, happiness, the unitive aspect of marriage is given new prominence in the Church's formal proclamations. Once more, teaching was more directly reflecting the lived experience of the faithful. It should not surprise then that there continue to be discussions around the nature of marriage, the role of procreation, and of course, the question of marriages which are de facto dissolved, but not de jure, not in law. The final example of change in the Church's teaching on moral issues is the one which I believe will most impact how our contemporary discussions on sexuality and gender develop. It is also the teaching which I suggest we as Church are only slowly and arduously coming to terms with. It is, many authors say, the biggest surprise of Vatican II, and contained within the final document promulgated at the Council on the second last day of the Council. I speak of the Declaration on Religious Freedom. In its second paragraph, the document declares, quote, the human person has a right to religious freedom. This freedom means that all men are to be immune from coercion on the part of individuals or of social groups and of any human power, in such wise that no one is to be forced to act in a manner contrary to their own beliefs, whether privately or publicly, whether alone or in association with others, within due limits. The Council further declares that the right to religious freedom has its foundation in the very dignity of the human person, as this dignity is known through the revealed Word of God and by reason itself, end quote. Now compare this to the statement of Pope Gregory XVI, a little over 100 years ago, or earlier, 100 years earlier in the Council, who condemned, quote, this absurd and erroneous teaching, or rather that folly, that it is necessary to assure and guarantee to whomever it may be liberty of conscience, end quote. Or more recently, Pope Leo XIII, who, although correctly is seen as a significant figure in the development of Catholic social teaching, had an understanding of the human person which would seem foreign today. Quote, he did not advocate freedom, equality, participation. In fact, he denied all three. Leo strongly condemned modern liberalism in his encyclicals. Freedom of worship, he felt, goes against the chief and holiest duty that calls for worship of the one true God in the one true Church. Freedom of speech and the press mean that nothing will be sacred. Leo recognized the basic equality of human beings with regard to origin, value, and end. But there are differences in abilities and powers of mind and body that call for inequalities in the institutions of civil life. The natural inequalities of the family, beauty, intelligence, thought, and courage involve social inequalities that are essential to the good functioning of society, end quote. The final document of Vatican II overturns this fundamental position held by church leaders for centuries and recognized the human person as an autonomous, responsible, and free human agent. The Church's teaching now had to deal with, quote, the moral person who is both subject and agent. By our actions, we make ourselves the kind of persons we are, end quote. The moral life could no longer be defined in terms of minimal requirements. It is now presented as a response to the gift of love that God has first showed us. But freedom has a price. The moral person only comes to know the path forward by developing an informed conscience. In other words, it's not that freedom of conscience means that individuals make their judgments in complete isolation from all external factors, but rather that each is responsible to engage earnestly in the process of moral judging. And that involves reflection on the four factors mentioned earlier: Scripture, tradition, reason, and experience. We can now turn to the question of the Church's teaching on the nature of male and female, and then, by logical consequence, speak to the document, Male and Female, He Created Them, and the question of gender theory. Official Church teaching recognizes that the questions created by contemporary understandings of the human person, human sexuality, and gender theory present new challenges to the Church. Many see the challenge in terms of a church which never changes its basic moral teaching. I hope that by now I have dissuaded you of that myth. Nevertheless, there is a challenge. But the challenge is created by the wholesale shift that has happened in many societies and thus cultures in the world. The Church today is reformulating certain fundamental aspects of its theological anthropology. What does it mean to be human? If we're created in the image and likeness of God, where do we see that image? The fact that European and North American societies are much less homogeneous than they were as recently as the middle of the 20th century means previously ignored understandings of humanity are being revealed and valued. The Church has become more aware of itself as a global church, and so is opening to the voices of the many peoples of the world. We're effusive about the good work of Vatican II, but perhaps we forget that the work manifests the grace of the Holy Spirit. How? Well, think about it. The Council was dominated overwhelmingly by white European men. Only the power of the Holy Spirit can explain how they were able to escape their own enculturated ideologies. Today, as faithful Christians, we participate in the development of the Church's teaching on human sexuality, because amidst all the changes described, we are finally hearing the voice of persons whose very humanity had often been denied. Heterosexual women, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer persons. I've already mentioned how historically the Church's teaching reflected a specific understanding of humanity in terms of a sexual binary, male, female, that's it. I don't need to revisit how that binary has played out in terms of social roles for men and women, and specifically in terms of often ecclesially approved denigration of women. Christianity uncritically inherited a gender essentialism from Greek philosophy, which at times led to a not just anti-woman sentiment, but also views which denied that a female carried the image of God. This view was overcome in the 20th century, to a great extent for Catholics by the reflection of Pope John Paul II and his theology of the body. Although holding on to the male-female binary, quote, rather than describing these differences as evidence that women are less godlike than men, John Paul II, describes these same differences as evidence that men and women have different but equal and compatible gifts, and together, as man and woman, image God. End quote. Aside from the limits of this approach in that it so emphasizes the male-female relationship and its function of procreation and does not go beyond biological determinism in our expression of divine image, John Paul II's approach is challenged by the evidence of contemporary science. Brianne Jacob observes that to be a woman or man is not an ontological reality, but a series of historical constructions which give real social meanings to our bodies. Moreover, it is a social construction with a flawed biological basis. There is no biological binary. There are women born without a uterus, without ovaries or vaginal muscles, women with genetic disorders that veer from the usual XX chromosome placement. Many people are born with ambiguous genitalia. Secondary sexual characteristics are even more assorted and varied. Women have hysterectomies and mastectomies. Many women may have a few things in common. When it comes to essentialist proposition, no one characteristic or property is shared among all members of the group identified as male or female. While there may be difference, there is no basis for a biological binary, end quote. Jonathan Heap and Neil Ormerod remind us of what seems often forgotten in the church documents on sexual questions. Quote, human beings are not reducible to biology, end quote. But if we deny the binary, are we destined to simply say that gender is completely definable by each individual? But is this not just another form of gender essentialism? The work of Heap and Ormerod can be of assistance. They propose an alternative to viewing the question in terms of essentialism and recognize the scientific evidence. Quote, alternative gender and sexual identities should be expected, and expected as the normal outcome of an inherently statistical process. In other words, for example, quote, it is normal for over time some small proportion of infants to be born intersexed in some fashion or other. The normativity of a predominating gender duality is not, biologically speaking, absolute, they say. So what historically has often been viewed as aberrant forms of human sexuality should rather be seen as forms of human existence which are statistically to be expected. However, quoting them again, societies decide whether or not to consider persons with alternative senses of their own gender and or sexual orientation to be persons at all, and whether or not their lives matter. Moreover, they make these decisions under the operative but not often explicit constraint of statistical heteronormativity. In other words, the dominant group are heterosexual. End quote. Although I would not suggest that this is a perspective which Pope Francis holds, for his teachings reflect the earlier view of gender complementarity. I would say that the position enunciated by Heap and Ormerod calls for a much more inclusive pastoral approach to all persons, as evident in the actions of Pope Francis. Here too they can be helpful, for they remind us that cultural meanings and social realities do not develop at the same pace. Rather than seeing the church as somehow living in the past, they observe that, quote, traditionally dominant Western cultural understandings of gender identity and sexual orientation have largely remained in place, while social organization has undergone a major renegotiation, end quote. Nonetheless, along with others, the church needs to, quote, take cognizance of and responsibility for the ways in which the constraints of statistical heteronormativity is likely to dominate unreflective culture making. If we are right, they say, that alternative gender and sexual identities are marginal and normal at the same time, and moreover, that the people embodying them are normally going to be a part of all cultural communities, even if always in marginal numbers, then there seems implied a moral opportunity to attentively, intelligently, reasonably, responsibly, and with God's help, lovingly generate social and cultural structures and roles that touch on gender and sexuality directly and the place of gender and sexuality in our communities." End quote. I think that we can now turn to another fundamental social teaching of the Church: the need to place the marginalized at the center of our theological reflection. Recognizing the limits of the traditional male-female binary, understanding Heap and Ormerod's notion of the statistical probability of alternative gender identities and the implications of statistical heteronormativity, we must, I believe, as a community of faith, admit our failings, which have inflicted violence on those whose existence has been devalued. Here I agree again with Brianne Jacobs, who asserts, quote, "Because of the violent history of heterosexual masculinity and femininity, the propagation of these ideals does not allow us to be free or freely give ourselves to each other and to God. In order to give ourselves as free gift to each other and to God, we must recognize complicity in the violence this binary has created. We must recognize the ways in which we each benefit from the histories that violently police masculinity and femininity across a multitude of racial and economic intersections. What makes us human, what makes us free, can never be that which has enslaved others. Those who are complicit must cry to God for freedom for all," end quote. Although a controversial step, I believe a step nonetheless was made in this direction in the interim report on the Extraordinary Synod of Bishops on the Family in 2014. In that interim report we read, "Homosexuals have gifts and qualities to offer the Christian community. Are we capable of welcoming these people, guaranteeing to them a fraternal space in our communities? Often they wish to encounter a church that offers them a welcoming place, a welcoming home. Are our communities capable of providing that, accepting and valuing their sexual orientation without compromising Catholic doctrine on the family and matrimony?" End quote. It is clear that we're not there yet, but I think that we are in the midst of some profound and positive changes. No consolation to those who suffer on the margins, but an important observation in order for us all to decide whether we continue to be open to the Spirit and become better witnesses of God's gift of faith, or as Pope Francis has said, do we quote, "spend our days content that this is the way things have always been done." Then the gift vanishes, smothered by the ashes of fear and concern for defending the status quo, end quote. Before I close, I'd simply like to offer a few cursory comments about the Vatican document with which we began. The document reflects a fear over the implications of something which the authors do not fully understand. We don't fully understand. It hopes to be a dialogical document, yet it shows no evidence of giving voice to those persons most affected by its focus, those students who are struggling with questions of gender identity. It homogenizes various perspectives on gender under the umbrella of gender ideology, without clarifying what specific forms of gender theory are under consideration. It reflects a point in a process, not the end of the process. But it also concludes with a most significant reminder to all. Quote, "Every school should therefore make sure it is an environment of trust, calmness, and openness, particularly where there are cases that require time and careful discernment. It is essential that the right conditions are created to provide a patient and understanding ear, far removed from any unjust discrimination, end quote. What is, unfortunately, often forgotten amidst the rather heated debates on these questions is that the primary mission of the Church is one of reflecting divine compassion and solicitude. Bringing joy and hope to the world involves nothing less than, above all, living the love we receive from the one who loves us all. Brianne Jacobs reminds us, quote, "The ultimate fulfillment of the human person is not according to procreation with a sexual binary. It is love. Love of one's embodied self in defiance of histories that shame it. Love of one's embodied self that is not based on violence to others. When we appreciate the value of our bodies along a binary maintained through violence, we are not free. When we love our bodies for what makes us holy, what makes us like God, then, as Copeland suggests, we will be free. This performative acceptance of the body reshapes history, making us able to reach our full dignity as a gift to one another and to God. Thank you.
So we have time for some conversation and questions. We have two people with microphones, and if you could be patient, we'd like to record and hear the questions, so feel free, and I'll let Myroslaw monitor.
I can't believe it. Please.
Well, personally, I'd just like to thank you. I'm a high school chaplain, and you almost brought me to tears, frankly, because we have students that the words are like burned into my mind. We had a meeting at one point, and it was these were students that were either identified as homosexual, gay, questioning, transgendered, and the statement was, "The church hates us." My God, if that is how you feel about our church and our community of love, we're doing something wrong. And to try to, and be, as Sister Helen Prejean says, the face of Christ for each other. We can't put up those walls, and we can't say you can come in because you fit certain parameters and you are left on the outside because you do not, or you don't even know what your parameters are. These students, they live a very challenging life. I think if you wanted attention, there are easier ways of getting it. It's just painful to sometimes watch their experience, and over the years to see them try to find out who they are and know they're loved.
Yeah.
And lovable. So thank you. I needed to hear these words today. And I've got your book, so I'm going to read it. But I think we do they're not easy questions and they're not easy answers, and I don't pretend to know them. Just know the individuals, and they don't recognize the dignity, or they're not used to having people condemn them for carrying it. The challenges that they have. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
I needed to hear this too. I'm a graduate student at Wilfrid Laurier University, and my major research paper, yet to be actually firmed up, but it's around the topic of, does organized religion foster or hinder the self-actualization of the individual? It's a really big thing, and I have to really narrow it down. But my lived experience as a Roman Catholic, I was stuck in thinking that there's no way that the Catholic Church can contribute in a healthy way to the self-actualization of every type of individual. But you've given me hope today in the thought of evolution. It's evolving, and I guess the question is, will it evolve fast enough before something, through the whole process of globalization and the individualization of religion, kind of renders it into a cultural relic, or will change and evolution happen fast enough?
Of course, I know the answer to that question. I'll answer it in two ways: no and yes. No, because if you talk about the pain of people, it's not fast enough. But is it hopeless? No. And I think it's part of hopefully what you got from this evening is, oftentimes we don't see the church changing, but it's happening. It's happening. And I think the more we, as members of the church, recognize how it has happened in the past, can push it to keep happening now. Now, I say that, not saying all change is good. No, I don't think any of us would say that. But I'm saying that from the sense of that's the biggest gift of Vatican II, I think, is this gift of affirming our conscience, of affirming our right to say, this is what I come to in good conscience. And we can't be afraid of that. But we've got to do it in good conscience, right? We've got to, it's not just about saying it, it's about recognizing who we are in the face of that God who loves us and how we respond to that. But the change is happening, and it's not just the change that's happening. I mean, that's why I'm a member of the church. The Holy Spirit is working in the church. Sometimes we're the biggest block, but
Thank you for this presentation. I hope this isn't too tangential, but I think I want to open a dialogue with you about this whole usury thing being benign.
Well, I would agree.
Usury is really, it's a fundamental part of capitalism, and parts of capitalism are certainly under scrutiny because it's leading us perhaps to the whole death of the planet, so that, while I like to think of those other three areas as places where the church has progressed and gotten closer to the truth, I'm not so sure about usury.
And my only comment is, I was saying generally it's regarded as benign nowadays. I'm sure there are huge problems.
So I was a youth group leader at my church up until I was divorced and came out. at which point I was told my morals no longer aligned with those of the church, at which point the students who I taught, as I am a grade 1-2 Catholic educator, they looked at those in charge and said, this is ridiculous. So I've now got 14 to 16, 17-year-old kids looking at the church saying, what's wrong with this place? You have taught us since we were 6, 7 years old. You've been a part of the church and part of this school for 15 years as a married heterosexual woman. What's changed? So I guess my question is, how do we open this dialogue for those people who are so unwilling and so critical of these changes that are happening when they're not only affecting the adults in the church, but those up-and-comers who aren't seeing any give as far as those in charge are concerned?
First of all, sorry to hear about your experience. How do we do the dialogue? Well, this is part of it. Engage. I mean, how does the church change? It changes because we start talking. We start talking about it. We start asking ourselves the questions of, do I really understand? Right? Have I formulated my opinions based on enculturated norms? Based on misunderstandings, or have I really reflected? So it calls on each of us to do that. And then it calls each of us to listen to your voice, to listen to everyone's voice. And to honestly say to ourselves, we need to listen. You know, we need to listen. And I do believe that the Holy Spirit is active and that listening will be fruitful. But there are some people who just are not going to listen. They just aren't, and I can't, like. It's so hard coming. Absolutely. Yeah. How powerless can you get, right? But really, absolutely, yeah. And
those people on board.
Yeah.
Firm in your knowledge.
In the Eastern Christian tradition, there's this wonderful holiness. It's called holy stubbornness. So stubbornness isn't always bad.
Hello. I'd just like to say thank you very much for your talk. You spoke about homosexuality. We have to be accepted for who we are and what we are. About 10 years ago, I attempted suicide because of my lifestyle, and I've come to know that people who support me and my sexuality, that's who I am. I think the Catholic Church has to change because homosexuals are human beings, and we're loved by God, and we're created by God. And it was a frightening experience for me, but thanks be to God I'm here today, and I have a lot of people who support me in my lifestyle. And thank you very much for your talk.
Thank you. If I can just use what you just said for those of us who aren't perhaps, who maybe we're heterosexual, maybe it's the best way to put it. What you said is really important for people to hear. Okay? And I'm coming from it, from the experience of our experience of having 2 children with disabilities. Sorry for putting it this way, but I'm going to suggest you didn't try to commit suicide because of your lifestyle. You tried to commit suicide because of the way we treated you. And we need to remember that.
Thank you.
Myroslaw, one of the things that I found very hopeful in your illustrations of the first 4 examples is that the change, it's hopeful and discouraging at the same time. The changes happened very slowly. And those who were more open to the change early on ended up condemned, anathema. And so I think what's hopeful in what you're saying tonight for me is to be part of the voices of the larger society, of the culture, so that there will come a point that the Spirit moves the church to act. I follow a Jesuit that some people may know, Father Jim Martin, a Jesuit out of the United States, and he published a book a couple of years ago about building bridges, and it was about building bridges between LGBTQ Catholics and Catholic parishes. And if you've ever read any of the vitriol of the trolls that respond and have condemned, and he's remained faithful to that. And so I think it's what you've said tonight is encouraging and hopeful, but discouraging at the same time, in that it's going to take time, as these changes did, as they've taken centuries.
I am hopeful, though, that because of the way communication works nowadays, it won't take as long. And the other thing, is, thankfully, I mean, we do have a pope who's acting in ways which we would never have imagined 50 years ago. We really do. And it's affecting the church. Sure, that interim document, that interim report of the Synod of the Family, that became controversial, that comment, and there were all kinds of, stuff said in that. But it still was there. It's in writing. I can quote it. Right? We can start turning to some of these documents and actually saying, this is what formal, authoritative offices of the church have said, which are different than what you might think. Or different from what we thought 50 years ago, or would have said 50 years ago. So it's more, right? That's I think we need, yeah.
Could you get the last slide up so we can see her quote?
That's the one. Let me go this way. That one? It's that one, isn't it? Yes, it's that. Oops, what happened?
One too many. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to see what you were quoting from because your slides weren't synced with your voice. So we're sort of, when you said quote, unquote, we didn't know what you were talking about.
I didn't have all the quotations.
Yeah. So I wanted to see this last one. The performative acceptance of the body reshapes history, making us able to reach our full dignity as gift to one another and to God. I don't think Brianne is talking only about people who are not in that centerpiece of most. And I don't think she's talking only about the people who are on the fringes of the statistical.
No.
I think she's talking about the whole spectrum, if I can use that mathematical, physical word.
I would agree.
So my question is, as we involve ourselves in this dialogue, how do we, within the dialogue, behave in a dignified way and a loving way? What's our cue? What's our, how do you see it happening? So we can talk to each other politely, if nothing more than politely.
Well, this might sound too almost trite. I think we all need to do a good examination of conscience. I think we all need to really, I guess I mentioned that earlier, ask ourselves, like, I think we all need to do a good examination of conscience, ask ourselves, where our perspectives have come from, what are they reflecting? Are they really reflecting our own belief in the gospel? What is the gospel? The gospel is about death and resurrection of Christ. The gospel is about the reality that love, God's love, comes into us and is revealed in and through us.
And so for me, the challenge is doing that with the person who seems stuck in wherever. Therein lies my challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes we have to just say, got to go somewhere else. Anybody else?
Just a small reflection on what's going on and the call to dialogue. So back when I finished university, a long time ago, as you can tell from the color of my hair, and I grew up in a very Irish Catholic community in Newfoundland. And going through, I made friends and was eventually a roommate while I was in university with a very close friend of mine who stayed close all my life. We're very close and very strong friends still. He also grew up in a very Irish Catholic community, about 100 kilometers away from where I grew up. And as we finished university, I remember that there's a conversation. He says, Ed, I have to tell you something. And he was afraid. And he said, I'm gay. And it left me with, at that moment, I remember, a decision, because I had a pretty binary, straightforward view of the whole thing. But what was more important was the relationship, the friendship. And that decision of, you know, you're my friend, you are who you are, so am I, different path, whatever. But it's more even dialogue. You go deeper into entering into a relationship, because then you discover what really is there. It's deeper than dialogue. Dialogue is the pathway, I think. I don't know if you want to comment on that further. Thank you.
Absolutely. Do I do a plug for our book? Do I do a plug for our book? The Trinitarian relationship is a model, I think, for all of our human relationships, because that's what it's about. That's how we are imaging God, by following that image of that community of three beings, three persons. However we want to form it, it's a relationship. There's another question here.
I'm an optimistic person with a pessimistic point of view about the ability of the church to make meaningful change at a meaningful pace. I mean, we're about 1 billion people, and we're across all of the continents. And to get such a diverse and large organization to make significant changes in a hurry, I think is probably unrealistic. And even if we look at it from the point of view of a diocese, it's a lot smaller, but we still have that huge, huge diversity. And I think if we really want to affect change in our church, in how we approach all of these issues, I think we need to look at our own parish first of all. I know in our parish, we have disabled adults that attend our church and have for years. They know that they're accepted in our church. I know that there are some gay families in our church, and it's never been acknowledged, but I think they feel comfortable because of how I see them and how we interact with them. And I think if we do even more at our parish level, that message gets out. And as the message gets out, more and more people will come to our church and feel comfortable there. And at some point, the hierarchy looks at what's going on and can't deny it. Because I worked with bureaucracies all my life, and I know how easy it is for one person to block change. It happens. But if your momentum builds up, parish by parish by parish, which means it starts with individual by individual and individual, I think then we look at what's happening in our Catholic parish, and if we like what's going on there, what a joyous thing.
You're I'm absolutely right. I think that the bottom line is, and that's why we begin with that personal thing, is the church isn't, that document. The church isn't that papal pronunciation. The church is everyone. And if we change, the church changes. Maybe we won't see it in a document right away, but that doesn't matter. Catholics were no longer having slaves long before the official document came out. Thankfully. We've got to change.
Just to segue a little bit off of that nice last sentiment, as a gay person in the church, and I've been not just in the Catholic Church, I've been across the board, I would just state for everyone involved, it's an important point that if you have gay families in your church and you interact with them on the day-to-day, but never actually upfront acknowledge their sexuality, they are likely not comfortable. Because it comes across that feeling of toleration. That as long as we kind of don't ask, don't tell, don't draw attention to it, don't actually make notice of it being there, it's fine. But they don't know if they were ever actually to outwardly be gay apart from just their own existence, if that would be tolerated or if that would be condemned. So just the simple statement of, how lovely for you and your wife to be here with us. Would you like to have some coffee? Something that small, but forward and direct and acknowledging is important.
Just to add to that, we also have 2 children, and to acknowledge that we are a family and not where's your husband also helps make us feel a little more comfortable in a parish. Or not asking my boys, oh, where's your daddy? Because biologically, yes, they have a father. But when we come to church, when we come as a family, it's myself, my partner, and our children. We are the family.
Thank you. Thank you. Important.
So we've had a lot of questions that center around how do we treat people better in the church. I'm kind of interested from the other way, because at the beginning you were talking about Henry Nouwen and how he was sainted. He was also homosexual, although he lived celibate and was lonely and struggled with loneliness all his life. So was he living the truth by doing that? And as a sort of follow-up, let's say that he hadn't been single and celibate for all his entire life like the church wanted him, would he not deserve to be sainted then?
Thanks for the question. And this is a sincere answer. You're asking me whether he was living the truth? I don't know. I can't know. That's where, if I assert what I was saying earlier about our being serious about having our own informed conscience, then we have to be our judge of whether we're living our truth or not. I can't judge that. Can't judge that. If somebody comes with a struggle to me and wants to talk about it, we can talk about it, but it's not up to me to say whether you're living your truth or not. I can't do that. was.
Thank you for the conversation. I'd like to invite forward Dr. Ann Jameson, who's the Director of the Office of Catechesis for the Diocese of Hamilton, to formally thank our speaker.
I have known that Myroslaw was a great teacher since I sat in his classroom in the Masters of Catholic Thought here at St. Jerome's, and he remains my good teacher. He's a good teacher because he doesn't just tell us about freedom of conscience and our responsibility and our agency. He invites us to participate in that, to take ownership of that, and to do something with it by raising questions for us that we have to wrestle with. On the way home in the car, I told Myroslaw before, it's why I brought my husband with me, so that I'll have somebody to talk to, because I know I'll have questions. It's so important that the dialogue continues. In the introduction to Discovering Trinity in Disability, I'll give a plug to the book because it's a wonderful book written by Myroslaw and his wife. They ask the question in the introduction, why introduce discomfort? Well, what would be the point? Why rock the boat in any way? And he says the answer is alarmingly simple, because of Christ. He goes on to say that Jesus persisted in hanging out with people who were outside the mainstream. And then in reflecting on the history of the church, they say the Christian church was seen as a place of sanctuary, where members could find protection from the brutalities of the outside world. As members of Christian churches today, can we do any less? And I think that that's the question I'm going to drive home with tonight. I'm so grateful for your presentation this evening that's raised those questions, that's assured us that we have the conscience that can wrestle with them, and to invite us to be with one another in continuing the dialogue. Thank you so much.
Some announcements before we finish up. So first of all, we send out regular emails about upcoming speakers. If you're not on our mailing list and you want to receive information about the lectures in Catholic Experience, as well as other lectures and events that take place here at St. Jerome's, please sign up at the welcome table in the atrium. Every year, we're happy to be able to present a program of speakers to the community, and we're able to do that because of the generosity of so many partners and supporters. If you too would like to support the lectures, there are donation envelopes at the welcome table. There are a number of fairly traded products available for sale in the atrium by our Social Justice Committee. Our local independent bookseller, Wordsworth Books, is with us this evening. Please make sure to visit their table, and I'll plug, that's my job too. Myroslav and Maria's book is there, and I'm going to assume that they're willing to meet you and sign the book and have conversation with you. The next lecture in Catholic Experience is going to take place on Friday, November the 15th at 7:30 p.m. Dr. Carolyn Whitney Brown, who is a lecturer in the Department of Religious Studies and a fellow at the University of Victoria's Center for Studies in Religion Society, was going to be here to present a lecture entitled The Paradox of Pleasure, Jean Vanier and the Growth of L'Arche. In this talk, Dr. Whitney Brown will explore the often surprising stories of the founding of L'Arche communities around the world. Communities where people with and without intellectual disabilities live, work, learn, and grow together. According to Jean Vanier himself, the secret behind L'Arche's growth is pleasure, an observation that can give us insight into the success of this amazing global movement. The first of our Bridges lectures is taking place next Friday, October the 25th at 7:30, right here in Vanstone. And that lecture is entitled The Glass Problem, Changing and Challenging Material Definitions. Just sit with that one for a while. If you thought tonight had us a lot of stuff to think about, that lecture is going to feature Patrick Charbonneau from Duke University and Catherine Larson, who is Assistant Curator of Ancient and Islamic Glass at the Corning Museum of Glass. The first of our annual reading series is going to take place also next Friday. That's at 4:30 p.m. So you just come at 4:30, then you grab a bite to eat for dinner, and then you stay for the 7:30 Bridges lecture. So the first reading series is going to be with poet Susan Holbrook. And lastly, I just want to say thank you for all of you for coming this evening. Good to have you with us as always. Thank you for being willing to be engaged in challenging conversations with us. And thank you for whatever ways you help to spread the word about our lectures and events. So have a safe trip home and look forward to seeing you again. Good night.